Okay, back again. Ozonics Killerwinds podcast. I'm Cole Tanner.
I'm Nick Simon.
And we have got a pretty exciting guest today.
Very exciting.
Yeah, we've got Duane Diefenbach with us from Penn State. How you doing, Duane?
Good. Nice to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to tell a little bit of the backstory about how this all came about. It's kind of crazy with this day and age, with social media and everything else. I was flipping through my phone last week and I saw a post that came across about deer study in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And, I don't know the guy that did the post. Like, it was pretty awesome that he found it, you know what I mean? And he was commenting about it.
Yeah.
And he was commenting about an article that was written in this Lancaster Online, website.
Yeah.
Basically kind of like a e-newspaper, I think.
Yep.
Lancaster Online, so I assume that's what it means. And he was referencing this Lancaster Online, and I'm like, huh. And it was some of the things he said, I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
About deer movement and just some of the things I was just like, holy crapper.
Yeah.
And my background, I have a journalism and environmental studies degree from Iowa State. So, getting my bachelor's degree, you get pounded home
Yeah.
research and putting the facts and the numbers behind it and making sure that you're citing your sources and everything like that. So for me, right away, I went to, I want to see the facts.
Yeah.
Let me see the research. And so that took me to that Lancaster Online article. Well, then the interesting thing was the Lancaster Online article really just talked about the blog, right? Which was from what I could tell, I mean, geez, there's like hundreds and hundreds of blogs. Like I went down a rabbit hole
Yeah.
of, don't tell my boss, but it was like a little chunk of the day. You know what I mean? I'm just reading into these blog posts about all this crazy stuff. And I just kept going deeper and deeper. But the interesting thing is I kept from my education background, I was like, man, but this isn't the research. This is just kind of the observations. I want to really show me the research.
Yeah. Yeah. And you guys want to talk about a guy that got hot and bothered real quick?
I did. I was kind of frustrated because I was
he comes running into my office you're not gonna believe this.
Yeah, I'm like, well, here this guy's making some pretty big claims, but I want to see the actual research.
Yeah.
And so then it led me to the Deer Forest Study website because it was quoted in the article about the blog.
Yeah.
And that led me to that, which we'll put a link to right here.
Bing.
Bing. Which is awesome. And that really took me down a whole nother rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But then I kind of felt like that wasn't enough, right? So then I actually ended up trying to get a hold of Duane. And then I got a hold of a gal named Janine Flegel at the Pennsylvania Game Commission. I just called and talked to their operator. I'm like, this is an odd question. I don't know if you can put me in touch with the right person. And that's how I ended up. Janine talked to Duane, and then Duane gave me a call.
Yep.
And now kind of here we are. But the nice thing about Duane is, for me, I was like, I really want to get down to the brass tacks. I want to get down, how do I actually talk to somebody that knows the research?
Yep.
Dwayne, you know the research. It's interesting. I was spending a lot of time here on the Deer Forest website and reading in on all the different, because it's pretty awesome how it's laid out. And we'll put a little screen recording of the different tabs and how you can read about the study and the study areas. There's also a great thing that shows different podcasts that you've been on, different articles that have been written. And so I kind of deep dived into that. But that's kind of why I'm really excited that you're here, because I feel like, I don't want to say fake news, but I feel like we all have the tendency to believe everything we read on the internet.
Yeah.
And you see a TikTok post, and then people just start ranting and raving about it.
Right.
Even in the last couple of days, I called my buddies and I was like, hey man, I've got this guy Duane on that. Have you heard about the Pennsylvania deer study? Oh yeah. My dad sent it to me.
Yeah.
Somebody that post is up to 2.5 million views.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
One TikTok from a guy that's not even I never knew who the guy was.
I don't know who he is
I
either.
think he just posted it and then it just blew up.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of interesting that that's kind of a roundabout way to say, for me, I really wanted to get down to the research and to the numbers and to talk to somebody that really understood it.
Yeah.
And so that's why, Duane, I'm really appreciative that you came on with us today, and we're just willing to spend some time and just kind of talk through some of it.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that TikTok vlog or whatever they're called, we've been out here doing work for 10 years, and Janine and I have written hundreds of posts, and yeah, that one vlog reached a whole lot more people than we have in 10 years, I think.
Well,
And
yeah.
there are some kernels of truth in there. I think some of them are kind of out of context, and maybe today we'll talk about this stuff and people have a better understanding of sort of the little nuggets of information that piqued people's interest.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like you're hitting the nail on the head there, because that's what I got so ruffled up about. Is I'm like, man, I feel like some of this stuff is taking out of context. Like, they're making some pretty bold statements in this article.
Yeah.
And to your point about that this has been going on for 10 years, and there is some great information on the site.
Yeah.
And there is a downloadable file that you can see that has, kind of some of the high level notes. And I think you guys are going to have to redo your the numbers that you have on there about how many people have looked at the blog and how many clicks it's had, or how many Twitter bings it's had. Or I think you need to put TikTok on there, because there's 2.5 million people in the last week that are thinking about this.
Well, and that's the thing too that's super cool about this entire thing, the entire research project, for the diehard bow hunters, even just people who love deer alone.
Yeah.
Everything in this is super interesting. I feel like it's stuff that we're always thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that this whole thing is super cool. And so I'm super excited to talk to you today and hopefully learn something, because I think a lot of people are kind of having the same questions that we will probably have as well. So it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think initially, Duane, one of the things that, as I dug deeper on the website, when I dug deeper into other podcasts that you've been on and other information that's been written, I feel like one of the big things that was taken out of context is it's kind of talking about this blanket statement of deer movement, and when they move, but listening to the stuff that's on the different publications that have done different things and different things that you've said, it really opened my eyes to the fact that, we're not just talking, and what you guys are describing in the study, and we have to get more into deeper detail, is it's not specifically just about the breeding season being, mid-October through mid-November. The deer movement that you guys are studying is from January 1st till December 31st, correct? It's not just, you're not just looking, obviously, we're interested in the breeding cycle and the breeding period, but it's about the whole year. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we've got callers out there that can get, locations once an hour, 365 days a year.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about how many deer you guys have collared on a year-to-year basis, and or of that, how often are you pinging those collars depending on the time of year?
Yeah, it depends on our objectives. That we've been doing this for 10 years, so some things have changed over time. But the collars that we have today they're basically a GPS unit hanging around the neck of a deer.
Okay.
And those units communicate with a satellite. So as those deer GPS units collect a location, it just sends that data to a satellite, and then we can retrieve those data. Not quite in real time, but pretty darn close. We might be lagging a few hours or something like that. And we can communicate with those callers in that we can, set a schedule. They call it a fix rate. And it, if we want to follow a deer for multiple years, we have to really back off on that, because our limitation is battery life.
Mm-hmm.
And if we, let's say we got a location once every 7 hours, we catch our deer, let's say January through March, and we'll set it to get a location once every 7 hours, so 3 times a day, and it ends up cycling through the day because that's an odd number.
Mm-hmm.
And then in September, October, we can switch that to once an hour. And then one of the things we were really interested in when we first began this study is how deer respond to our rifle season, because Pennsylvania has a lot of deer hunters.
Absolutely.
And, this day and age, it's over 600,000 deer hunters, and many of them are out during the 2-week rifle season.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were interested in how those deer move. So during the rifle season, we actually could send a signal to start getting a location every 20 minutes.
Wow.
And if we did that schedule, we don't get a lot of detailed information January through August because we're only getting a location every 7 hours. But we can track a deer for several years.
Isn't that something?
Because we're not just interested in movement, we're interested in survival and harvest rates and those sorts of things. So if we can track a deer over time, over longer time periods, that's really important for our research.
When you guys are doing the collaring in the winter months, that you try to collar a mature doe or a mature buck because generally their home range is smaller. The collars aren't cheap. So they collar a young buck, and then all of a sudden he walks out of their life.
Yeah.
Or out of their area, then they can't. It's it's $2,500 gone.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What age of deer that you're trying to collaring to that's most conducive to your study?
Yeah, so we only collar adult deer, partly for that reason. Also, you like younger animals, you need to accommodate for changes in neck size and that sort of thing, and it's even pretty difficult with adult deer. Putting a collar on a deer is as much art as it is science.
Oh, really?
So we're catching adult deer. We unfortunately you can't really, you can age a deer at that time of year pretty easily as either a fawn or an adult, but whether it's a year and a half, 2.5, or older, I can't really tell you.
Okay.
But some of our deer we've followed, like our males, for 3 years. So if we caught them at a year and a half, add 3 to that, so some of our deer are 5 years old, and every deer we catch gets an ear tag.
Okay. Yep.
So we get some information from those deer, and that helps us with getting estimates of harvest rates. And then we try and collar about 10 deer per study area. We collar more females than males, because if you're managing a population, the females are way more important than the males, even though everyone likes to know what's going on with the males.
Yeah, exactly.
So, our goal is to, at the end of our trapping season, to have 40 deer on air.
Got it.
It's tough work. We don't always achieve that, but we've been at this for over 10 years, so we've trapped hundreds of deer.
Isn't that something? Even how they trap the deer is pretty interesting. He talks about that they have these clover traps, which sounds like you think, oh, it's a clover plot, but that's the clover part is based on the person that designed the trap. But a trap that they would like put corn in, and then the deer walks in, and then it has a door, and it goes shut somehow. Or they have these, which this part sounds fun. If you guys ever need a volunteer, I would totally volunteer for this rodeo part. They have these, they call them rocket nets. Your guys' rocket nets are huge, like 30 by 60, right? Like they're big. Like you could net more than one deer at a time, right? You could net multiple deer, 30 by 60.
As long as they don't outrun the net. That's
crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. And then you guys, if you're netting them like that, I think you had said before, you have to sedate them generally because the stress of that situation can be really rough on them, but it's just easier to do what you do if they're sedated, correct?
Yeah, if we catch a deer in a clover trap, and our technicians get pretty good at it, they can go in there, restrain the deer, ear tag it, put a collar on it in probably 5 to 7 minutes.
Wow. So that's the art part right there.
Yeah.
So that's not a lot of stress. It's a very short period of stress. So, 5 to 7 minutes, then we let the deer go, and it's off.
Mm-hmm.
When you catch a deer in a rocket net, even if it's just 1 or 2 deer, they're all tangled up, and to get them out of the net, you have to sedate them,
right?
Just to reduce that stress level,
right?
And but we're in wooded areas, so we've also, in some of my research, we also use drop nets, which are, even bigger,
Wow.
that have remote triggers. So they're up over the deer, and you put bait in the middle, and it releases and it just drops down on the deer, and you can catch even more deer that way. But in our forested areas, we don't have big openings like that. So we do occasionally, we have a big enough space that we can use the rocket nets.
Interesting.
But the clover traps are really the bread and butter,
Okay.
because you don't have to sit out over them, right? The crews can just check them every day.
Right.
But a rocket net, you can put up a game camera and you can say, oh, they're coming in every night, and then you go sit out there and freeze your butt off for 3 hours, and the wind blows the wrong way and they snort and take off. So.
Yeah. We need to get you some ozonics. We can help you with that part. I think maybe just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just set some context, I think, because I think it would be really important for your listeners to understand where we're studying these deer. So we're in Pennsylvania. We have 2 study sites in central Pennsylvania and 2 study sites in north central Pennsylvania. So in central Pennsylvania, we have what's called the Ridge and Valley region. And so we have these long linear ridges. Most of the farming and housing is in the valleys, limestone soils in the valleys, and sandstone soils on our ridge tops. And our study areas are on state forest land, so they're large tracts of contiguous forest. So there might be, a paved road. Well, is there even a paved road? Most of our study areas are just gravel roads, single lane, like on a state forest property.
Right.
And of course our central study areas in sort of a mixed oak habitat, but just completely contiguous forest. The same thing, similarly up north, in north central PA, we've got 2 study areas. Each of these study areas is like 25 to 40 square miles, so they're pretty big.
Yeah.
And again, it's just contiguous forest, but that's more of a northern hardwood, so you're going to have maple, beech, yellow birch type of habitat. It's all public land, and open to hunting. So you asked a couple things about the movements and sort of that kernel of truth that was in that TikTok video.
Yeah.
So we're in contiguous forest, lower productivity, so you're going to have larger home ranges. So our females and males outside the breeding season have a home range of about 1 square mile.
Got it.
Now it varies quite a bit, but on average it's about a square mile. Then during the rut, you're going to see male home ranges double or quadruple.
Crazy.
And female home ranges actually shrink a little bit, because it's the male who's seeking out the female, and the female wants to be found. And I always say, when you're lost in the woods, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, just stay put.
Stay put. So the female's not going to move as much, and that way it's going to increase the chance that the male's going to encounter her.
Yes.
So in contrast, if you go in Pennsylvania to more ag areas, and better soils, in our ag areas, you might see home ranges that are a quarter of that.
Right.
So a male home range outside the breeding season might be a half mile, and the breeding season it might expand to 1 or 2 miles. So that's just to give you a little context of how our study areas are different.
Duane, if you could talk a little bit about, I know I've heard you say this before, we talked about it earlier about a deer's home range. And I'd heard you say something before about if you think about a deer's home range in a 3-dimensional way, as in space and time, meaning there's space as X and Y and time within those kind of 3 dimensions. Does that make sense? So a deer may spend time where it beds and where it feeds, but then it spends so much time in each of those places that make up its home area. Is that right, Duane? Is that how you would describe that kind of home range?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to think about it because deer, especially males, their use of space changes over the course of the year quite a bit. So yeah, deer home ranges are for the most part pretty static, but then there's always exceptions and quirks and different things that we've seen that I can't explain why they do it. But there are some general patterns that hold that once an adult animal establishes a home range, for the most part, that's where they're going to spend the rest of their life. Exceptions are really rare. Their home ranges are usually blobs on the landscape, but you can see instances where roads and pipelines might influence, the boundaries. A deer, especially if it's a paved highway, deer that set up a home range in which a highway's in the middle of it usually end up dead.
Yeah.
And so, but even on our areas, like you'll see a road and a pipeline, and a deer's home range will fit, like in the corner there.
Yep.
They're unlikely to cross that pipeline. It's not that they can't or don't want to, it's just that a lot of animals use physical markers as, boundaries. Like we have our picket fences from our neighbors.
Yep.
We put up the boundaries, but deer take advantage of sort of natural features on the landscape, so you can see how rivers and roads and other features influence where they establish, a home range.
Interesting. So to think about that, like in the permission piece that I have, I've got a river there's a river on the north end and there's a gravel road on the south end.
Yep.
And if a deer's home range during the January through, before the rut, so let's say January through September is 1 square mile, 640 acres.
Yep.
I mean, just if you can think about drawing that type of an odd circle or egg or blob on a map and then go, okay. And then if it increases from 1 mile to, if it's walking 90 to 100 miles a week,
Yeah.
and it goes from 1 mile to maybe 3 to 5 miles, square miles, well, all of a sudden now I'm talking 3,000 acres.
Oh yeah.
And he's talking, and correct me if I'm wrong, Duane, but what you're describing on those numbers that I just mentioned there on this study, and generally the study areas are 95% or more wooded areas. Agriculture, he made a comment that those home ranges could be smaller. That's kind of interesting to think about.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's crazy.
My question for home ranges would be, do you have any data that shows that their home ranges may change once they lose their velvet and go to hardhorn? Because at least at our farm, there's a lot of times that we see deer throughout the summer, and then as soon as they go hardhorn, they just disappear. They're gone. So do you have any data that shows that once they go hardhorn, that they might move their core area a little bit?
Do they move their core area? Do they move their core area, and or do their movement times change? Because it feels like you can go out in the summer in July, August, September, and you can see deer in velvet.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they shed their velvet, and it's like they turn into a whole different deer.
Yeah.
And they're gone.
Yes. Yep.
They're just not where they were.
Yeah.
Does your data support any of that?
Well, let's see. So, by the end of July, they're still in velvet, but those are basically their antlers. The growth is done. I really have not seen any change in home range really until the rut kicks in. So in Pennsylvania, we're talking some breeding starts, in October, middle of October. But up until the middle of October, their home range doesn't look any different than September or August.
Mm-hmm.
By the third week of October, things are really kicking in. By the end of that month, probably 20% of females are bred. So it's usually the third week of October where you can see changes in bucks.
Okay.
And one of the things we don't have is, we don't have every single deer collared.
Right.
Yep.
So, I think deer movements could be influenced by the number of females in the area, their breeding status. And so we don't have that information. So when I see one buck who expands his home range in the middle of October and another guy who doesn't do anything until the 1st of November, there could be a whole host of reasons for that.
Right.
I have no idea.
Interesting.
But as a rule, on our study sites, I can't really detect any differences until the third week in October. And then, of course, those movements, you're asking about movements. Yeah, during the breeding season, everyone knows the typical deer, they're most active in morning and evening, right before sunrise and sunset.
Yep.
The rut changes that for males, where they're practically going 24/7. If you wanted to say they spend a little less time moving, it's like 4 o'clock in the morning or something, but really they are just walking,
Isn't that something?
and at a really slow pace, but they're doing it because they're doing it 24/7 for a month. Some of these deer that we're following are covering at least 90 over 100 miles
Isn't that
in
something?
those 30 days.
In 30 days, a month they're traveling 90 to 100 miles.
That is insane.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, and I know you had said, I had read and heard different things you talking about, people saying, well, what about movement with temperature?
Mm-hmm.
The old adage as a bow hunter is, and again, we're in Iowa, is, man, you can't wait for those cold November days.
Yeah.
If it's warm, we're all like, oh, man, it's going to slow everything down. But you made such a great point. If a deer's walking at 0.8 miles an hour, if you've ever walked on a treadmill at 1 mile an hour, that's like not very fast.
Yeah.
So does the heat affect deer movement? If it's walking continuously at 1 mile an hour, I don't think a deer is going to get wore out.
Yeah.
Walking at a mile an hour.
Yeah,
It's funny. I never even thought about it that way. If you can talk a little bit about what your data shows about if temperature is affecting movement in any way.
Yeah, so we've looked at sort of weather in different ways. So we've usually limited our analyses to like September and October.
Okay.
Because that's when our hourly locations kick in. I was saying most of the time they're, just 7 hours apart. And of course that's when hunters are hunting, so they're most interested in their movements at that time.
Yep.
And we really have not been able to find much effect at all. I think I had one student here at Penn State dive into the data, and she did a little project, and she was looking at how rain and wind influence their behavior, and the moon. And she said at one point, it's like, yeah, there is a difference statistically, but we have thousands of data points, and the difference is like taking an extra trip to your bathroom during the day.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we have not. I mean, we've windy conditions. Really windy conditions suggest that they tend to move a little bit more. Rain doesn't seem to affect females, but the males don't move as much during the rain. But again, those differences are really small.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
The bottom line is, whether it's miserable weather or good weather, we haven't really been able to find much difference. But I'm still not going out when it's pouring rain.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. That's actually one thing too, Duane, that I was really interested to find out as I was kind of cyber stalking you a little bit, trying to get prepared for this today, was you're a hunter. I know you've talked about being an avid upland game guy. If you ever want to come to Iowa, my brother-in-law, I know you said you like hunting over dogs. My brother-in-law's I'm volunteering him right now. So sorry, Justin. But if you ever want to come to Iowa and shoot some pheasants, let me know.
All right.
But
I'll keep that in mind.
yeah, but yeah, and I know you've talked about that. You are a deer hunter too, right? You like to try to fill the freezer with some venison every year.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I don't have a lot of time for archery, but because that's grouse season too, so
Yep.
there's a trade-off there. But muzzleloader's a blast. Pennsylvania, we have an October early muzzleloader season, and yeah, it's the best time of year to be in the woods.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I love it. I love that. To go back to what you just said a minute ago, I think that was one of the things that was a little bit taken out of context, or I think that really fired people up on social media was in the article. It talks about that, and you just kind of mentioned it, right? That does moon phase play a role? Does wind play a role? Does temperature play a role?
Yeah.
You know, for me, it's really interesting to hear what he's saying on that.
I know.
Because it kind of like makes you step back. And now, granted, the devil's advocate argument to this is this is Pennsylvania. It's not the entire United States. You can't just say that this is the only place and this is the way that it is.
Yeah.
Because there's, but in the same regard, you can't argue with a 10-year study.
Yeah. Right.
Right. I mean, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, big one, and we didn't talk too much about it, is moon phase, or people get really complicated about different phases, whether it's underfoot or overhead, and all this sort of stuff. And if you go through the deer literature, it's really it's all over the place in terms of some people found some patterns and other people's didn't. And I guess what I say is the motivation or the things that drive breeding in deer, not just white-tailed deer, but elk and all sorts of things, and deer breeders have shown this, is day length.
Mm-hmm.
And we know the biology. Day length triggers hormones in the glands in the brain that cause the breeding behavior changes, and you can if you have a enclosed building and control the day length or the light periods, you can make a deer breed any time of the year.
Isn't that something?
And so the reason for that is that a female wants her fawn to be born as early as possible in the year, so it has as long as it can to grow, so when it hits winter, it's as big as possible.
Interesting.
But you can't give birth too early, because then that fawn might be exposed to really harsh spring winter conditions.
Yeah.
So you have to find that sweet spot. Well, a deer's gestation period is around 200 days.
Right.
So you're not going to, we can't predict the weather 2 days ahead of time.
Right.
How is a deer going to predict the weather 200 days?
Mm-hmm.
But that day length trigger tells them, the species has evolved that the day length in the fall, or at least 200 days before the optimal time to be born, that's going to trigger breeding. And in Pennsylvania, we've looked at thousands and thousands of roadkill doe to look at whether they were pregnant or not.
Mm-hmm.
And you can date based on the size of the embryo, or you can backdate and figure out when did she become pregnant, or conversely, when was that fawn going to be born. And thousands of embryos over 10 years, and the mean date is the same date every year.
Oh, really?
There's no difference. And
Crazy.
so it's that, it's not the moon that's affecting breeding behavior. It's the fact that they need to be bred at a certain time, so their fawn is born at the best time of year to have the greatest chance of surviving the next winter.
Interesting.
Now, you might ask, what happens where you don't have a winter? Well, if you go down to Florida, They have a very extended breeding season, and if you go into South America, they could be breeding any time of the year, or it actually might be like in parts of Texas, it's driven by precipitation and when vegetation greens up. So,
Interesting.
the idea that the moon, no one has ever told me what is the biology behind moon driving breeding behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone talks about all these different things, but they can't come up. No one's been able to explain to me the biology. And what I just told you about the biology makes a whole lot of sense.
Yep.
And the data support that thinking over the fact that, whether it's a full moon or not has any effect on timing of breeding.
Right. Wow.
That's crazy.
So then my next question, what's the mean date? What you said that date every year is just about, what is that date?
So in Pennsylvania and most of northern U.S. would be November 13th. Half of our females are bred by November 13th.
Crazy.
Yep.
Man, Duane, I feel like you're going to be my new best friend. You probably shouldn't have given me your cell phone number because I'm going to be like, hey, what about this? Oh, that's really incredible.
That's super cool.
I'm like
That's
sitting
unreal.
here. I'm a fat guy, so I am
me too.
loving this.
I'm like in a trance.
I
right
know.
now.
I
I'm
feel like I am.
whoa.
I am just like really into this.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's pretty awesome. And yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm kind of speechless.
I know. Me too.
There's a lot there. I'll tell you what. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about these collars, as I kind of dug into that, looking through the blog posts, it's like going down this rabbit hole, and hearing you talk about it too is pretty cool thing. Those collars, they have like a way that they can try to get within a couple hundred yards of the deer, and then they can send a signal, and it will get the collar to detach.
Oh, really?
Okay. But talk about that, Duane, because I had heard you discuss how I was just like, oh man, this makes me feel like I'm never going to kill a deer again. Because these technicians will go out. They know where the deer is. Okay. They know where the deer is. It's telling them like, this is where the deer is. They know how they can get to it to try to get on the upwind side or, get where they're not going to hopefully get winded.
Yeah.
And he said sometimes they can't even get within a couple hundred yards of them. Like that just that's like disheartening. Like you would,
Yeah.
like it makes me feel like, so basically when I go hunting and I park my truck, the deer know I'm there. Yeah. I mean, am I right or am I wrong? I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like to me.
Yeah. So sometimes, if we have really bad weather, like in winter, a snowstorm, really wet, miserable, deep snow, some of our deer will sit so still that it actually will trigger the mortality signal. So these
Really?
collars, if the deer's moving, they know, okay, it's moving, so it's probably alive. But if it stays still for a certain amount of time, they'll send a signal to us saying, oh, there's a potential mortality event. And so we want to send our techs out to retrieve the deer to see what might have caused its death and retrieve the collar. And so they have to go out periodically to, see if this deer is still alive. And it's very rare that they actually see the deer. When they have, they can pick up a signal, they know what direction that deer is in, and very rarely do they ever see it.
Isn't that something? Dude, that is so
That is
crazy.
unreal.
Literally, it makes me feel like,
Yeah.
we're all like,
Well-
as hunters, we're so concerned about how we get in and how we get out. Pretty
It's
sure they know
even
where
worse than that, though, because, our rifle season, is really intensive with a high density of hunters.
Right.
And those deer actually know and change their behavior before opening day even begins.
Really?
Yeah, so, I was saying we switched over to 20 minutes
Right.
during that rifle season. And up until recently, Pennsylvania always had a Monday opener.
Okay.
So what do you think happens Saturday and Sunday?
Oh, batten down the hatches. That's what the deer are saying. Yeah.
Yeah, so everyone's going out to figure out where am I going to sit, maybe put
Oh,
up
yeah.
a tree stand.
Yep.
And so that activity, those deer respond to that activity, and by Monday morning, they were already going to their hiding spot and
That
just laying
fast.
low until about 10 o'clock or noon before they would even move again.
That fast. We talk about, and I was always taught that deer are conditioned learners. They learn
Yeah.
by the conditions that they encounter.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see and hear that within 2 days,
Yeah.
oh, something's different.
Yep. Something's not right.
And you talk about going to their hiding spots. What you're describing there is going to the spots where they just don't feel that pressure, is what you're describing, right? Where they just don't,
Yeah.
they're not getting bumped around, or where you would see their movement change, and then all of a sudden they go to this area and their movement is steadier because they're just not getting bumped, or they're not getting that pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. You keep in mind, I don't want to give the deer too much credit, right? I don't
Yeah,
think
yeah.
they're making a connection that, oh, it's it's the Monday after Thanksgiving and it's deer season again.
Yep.
But I think what happens is deer, what I've seen is they have a home range. That activity, they're going to flee that activity, and deer that flee an area where they go to, they don't get disturbed, are the lucky ones. The ones that don't find that spot probably get harvested.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, deer that learn that, okay, when this activity starts up and I go here, I'm not going to be disturbed. And so that's what happens. And looking at that, there's sort of certain patterns that you can pick out. Our Ridge and Valley has some really steep slopes. We also have like areas with talus slopes.
Okay.
Or maybe it may be forested, but lots of boulders, and it is, you're just afraid of tripping and smashing the scope on your gun, and why would you want to even walk there? And
Yeah.
it's can be 100% slopes, like 45 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And so the deer, they learn that in my home range, if I run here, I can just sit down and I'm not going to get bumped again.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, you can see those spots, and you can see that these same deer run to the same place every day. So, by well before 7 a.m. when it's, legal shooting hours, those deer are in that spot, bedded down, and they're not moving until middle of the day.
Interesting. That's crazy. Yeah. That would be the other thing that I would ask you, Duane, about that. I feel like you hear a lot of people talk about that you don't want to put too much pressure on your spot during the off season, because that could move a deer off. He could move his home range, or all of a sudden you're like, man, I had a deer and I was out there checking cams, or I was doing too much stuff, and all of a sudden he just vanished.
Yeah.
Do you see that, where if you put too much pressure, or if there's too much pressure on these study areas, that the deer's movement, or just where their home range shifts, like from the summer to the fall, or if that home range is where it is, that's where it is?
Well, I don't think archery season has any. I can't say that I can detect any effect of archery hunting on deer movements or behavior.
Interesting.
It's the intensive rifle season when most of our hunters are out pursuing them.
Interesting.
So some people, talk about having an area that you never walk in.
Like a sanctuary
And
type place?
that probably sanctuary. That probably makes a lot of sense, because if you create an area that they're never going to get disturbed, then that's where those deer are going to go, and it's probably going to. I mean, it potentially could increase your chances of harvesting a deer, because the deer are going there.
Yep.
And then set up wherever they're going to go when they leave that area.
Yep.
But these are public lands,
Yep.
right? There's no access restriction, except you might have to walk a little bit further.
Right.
And these deer don't leave their home range. They just have a spot within their home range that they're not going to be disturbed.
Interesting.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I think that's the big thing to remember to
Yeah.
keep in context is these study areas are public land,
Yeah.
you know, that people can walk out there
Yep. Anybody
any
can.
day of the year,
Yep.
whenever they want. It's open to the public,
Yeah.
you know. You think about what he's saying right here comparatively to your permission or lease spot
Yeah.
that you don't step out there but maybe a handful of times in the off season and then hunt it in the peak of the rut.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yep.
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, our work has also shown that harvest rates on bucks on our public lands are actually lower than on private land
Really?
because we have areas that are harder to access.
Interesting.
It's crazy.
That's crazy. I'm like, it's like, I've got a buddy that lives in Pennsylvania. His name's Zach Workman. And I'm going to be like, you need to listen to this.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to know where the bucks are, I'm pretty sure you should go check some public spots.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. From year one of this study to now, and I know you guys, this is ongoing for a few more years yet. How has the study affected the way that you do things as a hunter? Has there been anything that you were like, that light bulb, like an aha moment? You're like, wow, that is not what I thought. I'm going to do this differently now. Has there been anything like that you were just like, geez, that completely is opposite of what that you were taught by your dad, or that you just do now differently that the study has shown you?
Nope. I think the only thing I would change, and I don't do a lot of hunting on these large tracts of public land, to
Yep.
be honest, because I've got plenty of deer in my backyard. I've got
Lucky.
actually too many deer in my, around.
I'll come over next fall and I'll help you out. No worries. Just tell me when you need me there. Yeah.
So, but if I were going to hunt on these public lands, I would find these areas that are like if I was in the Ridge and Valley region, probably up near the top of a ridge that you can't drive to, you got to walk to.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, there's no way to get there before light, because you'd break your neck trying to get there in the dark. And you can't stay there till dark because you'd break your neck trying to get out of there at night. And it's going to, some of these, I've walked into some of these hiding spots that both buck and doe have used, and it takes you a good 45 minutes to over an hour to get there.
Interesting.
So if I were going to hunt these areas, I would be there, just when you can start to see some light and you're not going to break your neck walking in. Get up to the spot. Oftentimes they're on a southeasterly facing slope, because they've got west wind where they can smell anything coming.
Yep.
And they can sit on that bench or so and look and down below them and see anything that comes up from that direction.
Absolutely.
And so you'd have to scout that out earlier in the year. But if you could hike up there, you're going to spend all day, find a good spot, and you might intercept one of those deer, because they're not going to sit there all day. By 10 o'clock or noon, they're going to start moving again. And if you can find a good spot to set up, you might get lucky that way. And that's probably how you're going to find the older bucks on our state lands. Is that type of hunting. So that's what that would change how I would hunt, especially if my goal was after a big older buck.
Yeah, mature deer. That's interesting. We talked about that in a previous podcast. I had an opportunity to go out to Northern California and hunt coos deer years ago with a friend of mine. And that's what they would do. They would get on these spots, they'd glass these bedded deer, and you could always it was a general rule for them, and that's the same way I was taught, was a deer will bed facing downwind,
Yep.
so he can smell what's coming over his back and he can see what he can't smell.
Yeah.
And so we could glass we could glass Columbia blacktail. I'm sorry if I said coos deer at the beginning.
Yeah.
In Northern California with Columbia blacktail hunting,
Yep.
we would glass these bucks, and you could see how they were all bedded. It's like, okay, well, the wind's doing this, but over there it's doing this.
Yeah.
Because you could see the way they were all bedded looking downwind.
Right.
So they could see what they couldn't smell, but the wind was coming over their back.
Yeah.
That's really interesting to hear.
It is.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's pretty crazy. The other thing I was going to ask you about, Duane, too, is, again, to your point, it was interesting. I'm really surprised by that answer, because I thought there was going to be more things that kind of affected the way you do things, which is awesome. If it hasn't, it hasn't.
Yeah.
But I think in this day and age, there's a lot of things out there. Right, there are moon phase guides, and I'll be the first to tell you, I've used the red moon phase guide for a long time. There's different apps out there that have all these different things and algorithms that build probability on when there's going to be better deer movement. One thing I know in the Midwest, I hear a lot of people talk about in Iowa especially, is barometric pressure. Have your guys' do you have any data detailing barometric pressure on deer movement? I know obviously there's a whole other part of the study we're not discussing, and it's about how deer affect the forest in general, right? It's the deer forest study. It's not just about deer. We're specifically talking about that. But have you had anything that talks more about when it comes to deer movement with barometric pressure?
Yeah, that would be an awesome one. So here's the problem. First of all, during the rut, I don't think it matters.
Okay.
Right? They're walking 24/7. They could care less about the weather or anything. Their focus is on finding, breeding opportunities. I have thought about, using our data in September and early October to look at that. But I'm not a meteorologist, and I think the only way I could do that is to sit down and, record the weather every day. But, anyway, because you and I know you can tell when a front comes through, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you might get a line of thunderstorms, the wind changes direction, and all that sort of stuff. But when you look at weather data, trying to look at the weather data and say, oh yeah, the front came through here at X o'clock, on this day. I haven't been able to figure out how to do that.
Well,
I guess I need to collaborate with a meteorologist. But we could do that potentially. I just haven't had the time or the expertise to really collate weather data so that I could say, on our study areas, the front came through at this time, and then looked at behavior before and after that. But theoretically, that is possible. But I can tell you, as a hunter in the archery season, that might be useful for the first couple of weeks. But after that, once the rut starts, I can't imagine that it has any effect at all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to your point there, right, the accuracy of that barometric pressure. A lot of times when you get you get the weather on your phone, it's pinging a location that could be 10, 15, 20 miles from where you actually are. It's not, and that's, I think what you're describing is if there's a weather system, if there's a thunderstorm coming across, it might go by the weather station and ping it here, but all of a sudden this study area is 10 miles down the road, and that doesn't hit for another, however long.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's not very accurate. Right. So yeah, that's interesting. And I'll tell you what, that's the one thing that I definitely will take away from today. It almost, for me, I feel like the thing that I keep thinking is when the rut breaks loose, deer movement feels to me, it's like just a steady drum that's just beating along. Boom, boom, boom. And those deer are just cruising.
Yep.
And the best rule of thumb is to get out in the woods and be there.
Yeah.
Whether they move more in the middle of the day, or if they bed down from 4 to 9 or whatever they in the morning, and then they're, whatever. I feel like the thing I take away from today is when the rut breaks loose, deer are moving.
Yep.
And they're looking for does.
Yep.
Obviously, we know that.
Yeah.
But it's just that home range or their movement, they are seeking.
Yep.
And you just have to be out there.
Right.
Yeah, the only caveat I'd add is, like I said before, it probably depends a lot on local conditions, right? So, and that's the problem. You're out in the woods, you're one person, you're collecting your data and your observations.
Yep.
And that could be influenced by how many other females are in the area, how many are in estrus and ready to be bred. So as individual hunters, we probably see a lot of variation on the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
But as me sitting in my office looking at data, I can say that, this is the broad pattern. But what we're experiencing as hunters is the activity that's within 100 yards of our tree stand or whatever.
Exactly.
And so we get to see all this variability that I'm sitting in my office looking at all this data that's pulled together and saying, well, this is the overall pattern. But the hunters are experiencing all this variability.
Absolutely. I feel like that really hits a nail on the head as well, in the fact of what I feel like as I look through comments and you hear people say, well, my trail cams light up here.
Yeah.
And I think the thing and hearing about this home range and thinking about how and where a deer is moving, just to your point, Duane, we're sitting in a tree stand looking at a couple 100 yards each way.
Yep.
Our trail cams are even a smaller area.
Yeah. A lot smaller, actually.
Oh, man, if you really actually took and laid out your property or a piece of public land and then said, okay, how much of my trail cam is covering this piece of public land?
Yep.
It's what? Maybe like 20, 30, 40 feet?
Maybe.
By 10 feet?
Yeah.
Yep. And if they walk too far out, they don't get hit. If they just walk behind it or beside it, you don't get them. But then I feel like as we came to this today, heard those people are like, well, that's not what my trail cams are saying. Well, do you have 200 trail cams on your property? Because I don't know how you could cover it all.
Yeah.
Because does that make sense? Like you're only seeing such a small part geographically of what's going on.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep, for sure.
I feel like that was the redneck way of explaining that. I was hoping, Duane, you were going to say that like a lot more scientifically and smart than I did, but I feel like I nailed it right there.
We don't want to, I like numbers and data, and there are techniques to use trail cams to estimate density. It gets really, really technical, and we'd need another couple hours, so let's not go down
let's not go down that rabbit hole. That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And I totally want to be like, sorry, Tatum, my wife, I'm going to be home late because Duane's blowing my mind right now.
But I would say that game cameras could be really useful, because if you see a buck consistently in a certain area before the rut, then that's probably your best area to hunt, because that means that you're in his core area, his basic home range, and that he's going to be going everywhere during the rut, but it's still probably going to be centered on that area where you saw him in August and September and early October.
Interesting.
So I know it's always depressing to me, I was like, oh my God, look at these bucks, and look what this guy turned into this year.
Yeah.
And then it's like the rut, and you hardly ever see him again. So
right.
Maybe I'm just on the edge of his core area or whatever, but if you had a big enough area and enough game cameras out there and could kind of say, okay, I see this guy in this area before the rut, that's probably the best place to hunt, because that's probably your best chance of encountering him.
Interesting. Look at Nick. He's just got a grin on his face. Nick's already got a buck that he's watching, and he's got double brows, and he's all freaking out. So Nick's originally from Wisconsin, and he just moved to Iowa. And, as a bow hunter, everybody's like, oh, man, hunt Iowa, I'm pretty sure Nick, after this conversation, will never be hunting Iowa because he's just
Not
going to,
true.
yeah, he's going to be at Wisconsin because Duane said, this is what you got to do. And that's where he's like, hey, listen, the home area of this guy, his home core area is right here. Listen, we're within the 640 acres, so we just need to keep doing this.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, that's funny.
You really caught me there.
I did.
That's exactly what was going through
I
my
know. I can see your face. You're at a little grin. You're gonna call Zip right after this. That's all you're gonna be doing. Is you're like, you need to listen to this podcast 24 times, memorize everything that he said. Oh no,
that's too funny.
The other thing I was gonna ask you, Duane, is there anything from what has transpired over the last week with the article and some of the stuff that you've seen that you would like to give more context about, that you would like to clarify on, that you read it and go, man, I wish he would have clarified a bit on this. I wish he would have given more context on the hard work that's being done in this regard. Is there anything that you'd like to just kind of set the record straight with about the research?
Yeah, well, I would, the article and the TikTok video, there's really nothing. I mean, there's some context that might be needed for some of those things, but if people go to our blog or the website, they can dive into that themselves and get a fuller picture of some of those little pieces of information that were put out there.
Yeah.
So there really isn't anything that bothers me there. I'm grateful that more people know about our work and know about the website. So that's great, and I hope we get more visitors, because the reason we did this was to, share this information with what we're doing. I guess I would like to, just give a little more context about why we're doing this work.
Absolutely.
Because we're not doing it to study deer movement.
Right.
It's just a sort of a side benefit, because we needed to be able to monitor these deer and get at things like harvest rates and estimate number of deer on the study areas and such. But the real purpose of the study is really, like I always say, it really should be the forest deer study, but that doesn't roll off the tongue like the deer forest study.
Yeah, exactly.
And people are more interested in deer than forest. So,
right, unfortunately. Yeah.
There's a bigger fan club there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But really, what motivated this study and all of my research, over the past 20 years or so, has been guided by needs by the state agency in terms of we need to make deer management decisions, or in fact, we're on state forest land, the state forest land. People need to make deer management decisions with respect to their goals and objectives, or their mission and mandate for managing the forest. So we've always focused on what don't we know and what research do we need to help us make better management decisions. And so in Pennsylvania over the past 20 years, they've made some changes in hunting regulations and have really done a great job in bringing deer populations in better balance with the habitat that's there.
Yep.
If you were here in Pennsylvania in the 90s, and I took you for a walk in the woods, I would say hands down, the number of deer out here is the biggest problem facing our forests and the ecology of our forested ecosystem. But today, that's not the case. In fact, 10 years ago, I started to ask the question, we're still having trouble just getting tree regeneration, looking at the diversity of plants in our understory and our forests. And, hunters can say, I don't care about, wildflowers, but in the springtime, females depend on some of these wildflowers. It could be 50% of their diet, and they're crucial for the nutrients that they need to produce young. So the health of our forests is critical for managing deer, and managing deer is critical for the health of our forests.
Right.
And so this study was really to get at three things that we think right now are the most important factors that are influencing our forests. That is deer and what deer eat, and how that affects the plants that are either regenerating as trees or the understory diversity of herbaceous plants. We also have problems with competing vegetation. So we have ferns and ericaceous species like mountain laurel and blueberry and huckleberry that could be inhibiting the diversity of plants. So like ferns can get these root masses that just cover the whole thing and they can shade out. And we know from research that ferns can reduce regeneration of trees. And then the other factor is soils.
Right.
And, you know, if you go to Iowa, you're going to find deer with huge antlers. If you go to north central Pennsylvania, you'll be lucky to find a deer that can hold a candle to a big buck in Iowa. And that has to do with the soil.
Right.
And we have research in Pennsylvania that shows over the past 40 years that acid deposition has depleted a lot of those nutrients like calcium and magnesium that are important to the growth of deer antlers, but they're even more important to the plants that are growing in the forest understory.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at deer herbivory, you know, deer eating plants. We're looking at competition among plants, and we're looking at soil conditions and how those three factors interact to determine what you see in our understory. And the reason we picked those three factors is because you can do something about each of them.
Right.
So you can manipulate deer populations. You can use herbicide to control these, you know, monocultures of fern in the understory. And you can also lime to alleviate the soil depletion of nutrients.
Absolutely.
And so we're studying these three factors that we know are potentially a problem, and we can actually do some treatments to alleviate that problem. And we're trying to do this in a way to study those three factors simultaneously to better understand how they interact and what we can do to manage our deer and our forests for a healthier ecosystem. So that's really the purpose of the study. And I hope that when people visit our site, they get a little taste of that and hopefully some understanding of why that's important.
Absolutely.
It's why this has to be a 10-year or more study, is because you can study deer and get an answer in a couple of years or maybe 3 years.
Yep.
But when you start studying vegetation, you need at least a decade
Right.
to see changes, because plants, you know, they grow a lot slower than deer.
Yes.
The thing that I would add to that, Duane, where I felt like I saw a lot of great information that you just described about the study, was if you're on the website and you go to the publications tab, there's a PDF document that's like 20 some pages, and it talks about just everything that he just described. It talks about the deer, talks about the vegetation, it talks about the soil, and it goes in high level detail. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for something after you listen to this that really talks about that, go to that publication. I'll show it, or I will. I'm going to make Nick do it. Show it right here.
Bing.
Bing. Yeah. So check that out. But yeah, that's a great, and I appreciate you explaining that. And that's like I was saying earlier. I'll tell you what, you know, I'm not a researcher. My wife says I'm as sharp as a marble, you know, so not a very smart guy.
Yeah.
But, you know, I have a lot of respect for the people that do the research.
Yeah.
Because I really think that we all need to think of ourselves not just as hunters, but as conservationists.
Exactly.
And each individual state is doing a lot to not only help hunters be successful, but also manage this ecosystem that is the places that we love to go and spend time.
Right.
Because, I mean, you can, like I said, I graduated from Iowa State. I've talked about this 100 times. I took an environmental history class. It was my favorite class, and it was kind of sad because, you know, you don't know what you know till you know it.
Yeah.
And if we would have known some things a long time ago, there might be buffalo in a lot more cool places around the United States.
Right.
There might be elk running around in a lot of different places. There would be who knows how many different plants and animals that just don't exist. They've just gone extinct.
Exactly.
Because we just didn't know.
Yeah.
Or the research wasn't being done. And so I think it's awesome what you're doing, Duane, and I really appreciate you taking the time to explain this and talk to us about it, because I do think that it's really, really important.
Yes.
And not just from the fact that obviously we're very interested in the deer side of it.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to it.
Well, there's way more to it.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting, like hearing that about the wildflowers. You know, that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
You're going to have Zip planting wildflowers this weekend.
Probably,
You're
yeah.
like, we need our does need nutrition. Listen,
Yes.
it's important.
Yes.
Not just a food plot.
Yes.
Honestly, Duane, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Thank you so much. Like you said, there'll be links in the descriptions on YouTube. There'll be links in our bio. There'll be links on the website to the Deer Forest studies so you can check it out.
Yep.
Yeah, like you said, take the time to look into it. There's a lot more than we've even scratched the surface on taking the time to discuss. So thanks a ton, Duane. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to get the word out about our project, and love to share the news.
Yeah,
Yep,
absolutely.
Exactly.
All right, well, that's wrapping it up. So we're good to go. Like I said, Ozonics Killerwind Podcast. I'm Cole Tanner.
I'm Nick Simon.
Thanks for watching.
See you next time.
See you next time.